Okay, so this is continuing chapter 20, looking at the popular culture side and a little bit on the just culture in general. With a huge increase of people coming into the new cities, there's a lot more emphasis on kind of the entertainment side of things, culture side of things. People that have more leisure time. Some of that's coming from the better work hour conditions in the factories, the electric power options of keeping things open, and newspapers are going to be one of the best ways to communicate to the masses. Literacy rates are up overall as a country, and so mass communication through newspapers is a great option. The vaudeville idea coming in with entertainment is very growing popularity with vaudeville shows. It's kind of like a blend of a play and music, like a variety show, kind of like a talent show, but on a mass scale. And so sometimes they would even travel. But a lot of people that were looking for something entertainment-wise, politics became entertainment. People would go to hear people give campaign speeches. Kind of had the saloon culture with saloons and dance halls, and very popular for especially the working class. But it wasn't just entertainment. People would also use that as like a social hub or places for political machines to meet men to come discuss politics and work and whatnot. Definitely very much a male option for gathering for information and for social purposes. Women had a little bit different, very conservative manners overall during this era, kind of like the Victorian era of dress and morality, very conservative, especially with the ankle. I don't know what it was with you. Like women at this point, there are a couple of new sports, we'll talk about those, but you had croquet was becoming very popular in the United States, and women had to be very careful and often didn't play because if you were to accidentally show a skirt, like to lift up and show an ankle, that would be considered very risque. Tennis, however, was more common for women to play. Different spectator sports in general, you have some of the ones that are listed there. Football, starting out as kind of like a new sport between rugby and soccer is kind of how they saw it, and eventually became starting out with college football. Princeton and Rutgers played the first collegiate game. Basketball invented by Naismith during this time period. You also had basketball with Naismith, and baseball coming in as America's sport. Very democratic because pretty much anybody could attend. So it was very popular among especially masses. A lot more games, music. Ragtime was really popular. Let me see if this will play. Example of ragtime. Joplin is pretty common for ragtime. Some of you might recognize it as the ice cream truck song. But music is changing. Events are changing. Streetlights in vaudeville. Streetlights allowing people to stay out later and feel safer about it. Outdoor recreation was changing. They started an urban park movement because the people's homes are so cramped. Getting outdoors was a much better option for so many people. I talked a little bit about women before. Women are having more opportunities out in society other than just kind of, being in the home and raising kids, but you have them working, you have them going to college. Education is changing. Sports are changing. First modern Olympics happens in 1893. Vaudeville, I'm going to skip this one just because it's an example of an act that would be done. Here's some early sports team pictures. Baseball and basketball. Some more. Changes in family life. No family life among the poor working class, meaning because they weren't ever home. If you were among the poor classes, that meant everybody, including the kids, were working. So you really didn't have much family time together. Plus, most of the time they're working at least 12-hour days. So there's just really not much time together as a whole. The middle class is trying to keep up, but finding less and less of a place. Like I said, women are becoming more assertive, especially education was a great opportunity for that. Vassar, women's colleges like Vassar were opening up 1865. This was the first women's college to teach at a lot of the same standards of male colleges. Wellesley and Smith colleges were starting to come in, and then education itself as a whole was starting to become more stringent on higher math, more classical languages, vocational training, arts, a lot of other occupational ideas and skills training. Like I said, the new women class, women are becoming more assertive socially, starting to talk about things that before had never been considered appropriate for their gender to discuss out in public. And I think that was it for that one. Alright, I'm going to pause real quick. I'm going to pull up chapter 21. Okay, so I'm going to start chapter 21 here since we wrapped up chapter 20 and saving the video space. So this is going to be wrapping up the politics part of the Gilded Age, looking at the problems with corruption, personal greed, the captains of industry, kind of characterizing the Gilded Age. Think Mark Twain. Look through your BOK, and there's a couple of handouts in there about the Gilded Age. It's a really good review for you. Okay, education. Touched about on that a little bit on the last one, especially with opportunities for women. But education is going to change at this point as well for being able to educate the masses and making it more applicable for larger groups of people, whether that's between different races or genders. But there's few that have been reaching higher education, so they're going to start to see more emphasis on that at the higher colleges. Now, when it comes down to the lower levels, you still have very basic education, and you also now have segregation, which have been supported by the 1896 Supreme Court decision with Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed for separate but equal facilities. New classes among higher education, they're trying to also focus on discipline, morality, make it more of a challenge that if you graduated from college from one of these universities, that the reputation that came along with that of the prestige and the training and the strength of character that you would have had with that. And then I talked about the women colleges on the first part of the video. Okay, so some early parts of reform that we're starting to see during this era, and we're going to talk a lot more about this when we get to like chapter 23, I think it is, the progressive era, but people who are starting to see the problems of the Gilded Age. People like the social Darwinists who are seeing reform, any kind of help or bailouts as problematic, saying if a company is going to fall or part of the industry is going to fall, then let it, because that's just survival of the fittest. And taking that idea of survival of the fittest and now applying it to society and business. Reform Darwinism is looking more towards the living and the working conditions overall. There are those who are kind of criticizing the amount of wealth in the small percentage, and actually had increased or talked about increasing the amount of taxes in the wealthy bracket, and including 100% tax once your wealth had reached a certain amount. Then anything over that would be taxed 100% and then redistributed to the poor. He was not a popular person. Kind of a Robin Hood idea. There's others who are coming in talking about things like Clarence Darrow. He said it was crime, not poverty, that is the problem. Those who are talking about social gospel, who are looking at reforms but also improving people's environment and improving their religious devotion as well, so kind of pairing religion and evangelicalism with reform, so like religious-based charity work. Settlement houses, people like Jane Addams, very common within urban centers, within urban neighborhoods, and these settlement houses were like little small hubs of places where they could help people with education, health clinics, places to bathe, because it's not always readily available. And the most famous one was Jane Addams, who had the Hull House in Chicago. Social welfare, most of it's private charity work, not a lot of government support this early on, but starting to get more of a call for helping out the less fortunate. Okay, for politics, it's kind of at a stalemate for what had been existing before the Gilded Age. Still mostly white males that make up the electorate. Women are trying to gain suffrage. 19th Amendment will not be passed until 1920, but in some of those western territories and states, women had a more likely chance to be given the right to vote in some of those western states. And then if you're a freedman, you're limited by a lot of those loopholes, literacy tests, poll taxes, that try to work their way around the 15th Amendment and guaranteeing people the right to vote. Post-Civil War, Democrats and Republicans are pretty much at a deadlock in terms of representation, pretty much exactly how they had been before. Neither one is going to make any bold moves or confront any real issues. Very high voter turnout during this era of 70 to 80%. But they're looking at tariff rates, regulation of corporations, money issues. Extreme kind of partisan divisions are not really changing, other than just adding on new issues to Republican and Democrats. And then looking at the state governments for some of the state and local corruption levels. Presidents after the Civil War, Andrew Johnson, who was the one who was being impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act. And then we go into the Gilded Age presidents, and we're actually going to do something in class to kind of go into those a little bit more in depth. But just kind of a quick recap or summary of for each of those. You have Rutherford B. Hayes. He was one who had the Compromise of 1877, who had corrupt bargain number 2, ends Reconstruction in the South. Garfield, promoting lower tariffs, civil service reform. Arthur, who is strengthening the Navy and also promoting civil service reform. And then Cleveland, he was the one involved in the Great Railroad Strike. He used his veto to stop a lot of the federal activities. And we'll get into a lot more of those. Plus, you have in one of the pages in your BOK another quick table on those Gilded Age presidents. Okay, so Republicans during this era, Republicans have control of Congress and the White House, kind of breaking that tie and seeing a bigger increase for the Republican Party. You have a couple of new laws in this era. You have the McKinley Tariff, which is going to put the taxes at an all-time high than we'd seen before. There's also the Sherman Antitrust Act, which came in 1890, which we talked about before in class. But really the first attempt to limit these big business trusts and monopolies. Not really well enforced, not until Teddy Roosevelt, who came in 1901 as president. But it did exist. And then you also have the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which was trying to get more of the paper currency backed with silver, because that's going to start to become more readily available than gold. In this time period, like I said, with Republicans, they're going to start to become the majority. They're pushing more of the nativist issues. Presidents overall, not really a strong president between Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, so pretty much this whole era just really didn't have a lot of great leaders. And people begin to not really expect much to be done by their federal government, so a lot of it comes more from the state and local level. The people that are on the farming side of things are going to start to have a lot of complaints. Farmers are going to, and the agricultural part is going to start to get a lot of complaints on not being able to keep up, not getting a lot of the preferential treatment. Protective tariffs usually hurt the agriculture side. And they're going to start their own interest group, starting with the Southern Alliance, the Grange, National Grange, and starting to become the beginnings of the Populist Party. The People's Party, the Populist Party, are going to split from the Democrats, and in the 1892 election, they actually draw over 1 million votes. Like I said, one of the more powerful third parties that we will see during this time period. Quick questions. Whoops. The Panic of 1893, starting with some of the failures of the railroad, begins a financial panic. This was probably one of the worst that we'd seen at this point. The worst to this date anyways. 2 million jobs lost. Corn crops are going to fail. And Democrats had just taken over, so they're going to carry a lot of the blame that came with that. Some of the literature themes at this point, starting to see more of a realist approach, rather than kind of writing in big idealistic themes. People are going to start to look at attacking specific problems within society, or starting to point out certain inadequacies. Election of 1894, Democrats are going to become still very much in the South, but Republicans are going to start to become more of a majority, as you can see in that diagram. And the Depression of 1893 is going to show that there was a need in a federal government intervention towards society, whereas before a lot of the charity had been local and private charities. People are going to say, if we're going to want any change at all, you're going to need more federal involvement. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I'll pick up in the next video with the presidential election of 1896.